Hello guys, welcome to the next video on labour markets, which is the section where we talk about government intervention in the labour market. And the first type of intervention is the national minimum wage. So by the end of this topic, you should be able to analyse and evaluate the impact of a minimum wage in the labour market. And you often get a question that says, what would happen if we raised the minimum wage? And you can use the same kind of analysis as we're going to show here. So what is the national minimum wage? So in the definition of a national minimum wage is a pay floor below which wages cannot fall. So it's a floor rather than a ceiling. And today in the UK, the current national minimum wage rate for workers aged 25 and over, which is also known as the national living wage rate, is £8.72 per hour. Now, many of you who are aged 17 or 18, you will be paid a minimum wage if you work, which is slightly different to that. There is an under 18s minimum wage, which is £4.55 per hour, and an apprentice wage, which is lower than that still. And as an exercise, you might want to think about why the minimum wage is lower for younger workers than it is for workers aged 25 and over. You'll notice there's actually 5 different minimum wages, and the rate rises as your age rises. So the younger you are, the lower the national living wage. So have a think about why that might be the case, and answers will be posted next time. Now, the government have taken on the name living wage or national living wage in order to name their minimum wage rate for workers aged 25 and over. Now, the term living wage was not initially coined by the government. It's a term the government have adopted, and it's therefore you can end up confusing the government's national living wage with what is sometimes called the real living wage. Now, the real living wage was founded by the Living Wage Foundation. And this is a scheme where businesses can sign up if they want to. They can voluntarily sign up to be a living wage employer. Now, this wage rate is different to the government's national living wage, and it is higher than the national living wage. Currently, the Living Wage Foundation's living wage is £9.30 per hour, but it's higher for workers that live in London. It's £10.75 per hour. 6,000 employers have signed up to this in the UK, and they can say that they are a living wage employer. So one question I'd like you to ponder and answers next time is, why would an employer become a living wage employer? If the cost of production rises, which it will do if you pay, for example, if you go from paying the national living wage to paying the real living wage to your workers, the cost of production will go up. With ceteris paribus, that would reduce your profits. Why would an employer become a living wage employer? So answers for that next time. So if we look at the impact of a national minimum wage, first of all, in a perfectly competitive labour market, then the pay floor will be above the market clearing. If we put a national minimum wage below the market wage rate, that would have no impact on the labour market. So if you were paying your cleaners, you should say you have a cleaning firm, you're paying your cleaners £6 an hour, and the government says, well, you need to pay your workers at least £3 an hour, nothing's going to change. You're going to keep paying your workers £6 an hour. Just because the government have a minimum wage of £3 an hour, you're not going to pay your cleaners anything different to £6 an hour. However, if the government says you've got to now pay your workers £8 an hour, then that will have an impact, because that £8 an hour is above the market wage rate, which we're saying here might be £6 an hour. So the national minimum wage rate is above the free market rate, a WMIN here. So what's the impact of this on the labour market? Well, first of all, the quantity demanded of workers is going to fall from E star to E1. We're going to get a contraction along the demand curve for labour. Higher wage rate, ceteris paribus, means lower profits for the business. So we're going to have lower quantity demanded of labour. Ceteris paribus, a profit maximising firm will employ fewer workers, the higher the cost of employing those workers. However, from the employee's point of view, or from workers' point of view, then there's going to be an expansion in the quantity supplied of labour. Existing workers are going to be willing and able to work more hours at a higher wage rate. The opportunity cost of leisure is now higher at a higher wage rate, so the quantity supplied will expand from E star to E2. The problem, of course, for the overall labour market is that according to mainstream economic theory, in a competitive labour market, unemployment would result. So unemployment is the difference between the number of workers willing to work at the current wage rate and being employed by workers, the demand for workers at the current wage rate. And as the current wage rate is now the minimum wage rate, then there is now a gap between the number of workers willing to work and those demanded by workers, those demanded by businesses, I should say. So we have unemployment of E2 minus E. Now, the minimum wage is quite a kind of easy topic to get an essay on or a question on in the examination. And so students tend to score quite highly on it. There are a few things you can do to distinguish your answer, if you're doing an essay or an extended question on this, from everybody else's answer, because it's one that students tend to get attracted to. And one of the things you should know is which sectors are most affected by the minimum wage, because the minimum wage is not obviously paid for all occupations. In some occupations, there's a much greater proportion of those workers paid the minimum wage than for other occupations. So which sectors are most affected? Hairdressing is one, hair and beauty. Retailing, so working in a shop, that tends to be quite low paid. Hotels and restaurants, so if you're a porter, if you're a waiter or waitress in a restaurant, or bar staff possibly, that's going to be fairly low paid as well. Cleaning, so kind of menial, fairly unskilled occupations like cleaning and refuse collection, bin collection. That's fairly low paid. And workers in the care industry tend to be very low paid as well. So these industries are the ones that are going to be most affected by a rise in the national minimum wage. So good to learn a few of those and be aware that sectors will be affected differently. The greater the intensity of low paid workers in those sectors, the more those industries will be affected by change in the wage. So, what are the arguments for a minimum wage? What are the advantages? The first one is that it could reduce in-work poverty and narrow income inequality. So if we raise the wage rates of those who are very low paid, and we'll see shortly that there's been quite a big rise in the minimum wage above inflation in the last few years in the UK, then this could reduce in-work poverty and narrow income inequality. So it's not the case anymore in the UK that those who are in poverty are necessarily out of work. A lot of people who we would define as being in poverty, particularly relative poverty, actually do have a job. It's just the job is very low paid. So we do have an argument there for a minimum wage. Secondly, reduced worker exploitation. So a lot of people that are paid the minimum wage are often work part-time. They're often female workers. And they're often work in jobs which are not very heavily unionized. So the sorts of jobs that pay the minimum wage are the sorts of sectors where worker exploitation is more likely. And so there is quite a strong argument there for the minimum wage to reduce worker exploitation. There'll be a greater incentive to work. So you may have heard of the poverty trap and the unemployment trap, that it may pay not to work if benefits are quite high, or if the extra tax rate that you pay from being in work is so high, then particularly for low paid jobs, then it just might not be worth working, because when you work, you pay more tax and you lose your entitlement to benefits. So it might be not worth you working. So if we have a higher minimum wage or a minimum wage, that will reduce that disincentive effect. It will raise the incentive to work. Linked to that is something called efficiency wage effects. Now, if we look back at MRP theory teaches us that there is a positive link between productivity and wages, and a line of causation, according to MRP theory, runs as follows. The higher the MRP, the higher the wage rate. So when productivity rises, the wage rate rises. Because if productivity rises, demand for labor goes up, and so the wage rate goes up. If productivity falls, demand goes down, and the wage rate falls. Now, the efficiency wage is actually arguing the other way around, where the causation, the line of causation is working the other way around. It's saying that if there's a change in the wage rate, that will lead to a change in productivity. It's called an efficiency wage effect. So it's saying that if we pay workers more wages, in a sense, they have more to lose if they lose their job, or if they don't work as hard, for example. So the higher the wage rate will induce workers to be more productive. And if they're more productive, then that will actually raise the demand for labor, and it will raise the amount of revenue and profit that those workers will make for the business. So a higher wage will pay for itself. If you pay workers what they think they're worth, then they will go to work happy, more motivated, and more productive. Another thing you could argue is, from the business's perspective, if the government says that the business has to pay higher wages, then the business might think, well, rather than getting rid of those workers, why don't we invest in those workers? Again, let's try and make the wage pay for itself. So if we get higher wages, if there's a minimum wage, then that might lead to the businesses deciding to invest in their workers. If they decide to keep their workers rather than make them unemployed, which may well happen in sectors where demand is very inelastic, hairdressing again might be a good example here, then businesses might invest more in their workers, make the minimum wage pay, make it work for them, make it work for the business. And another one, again, this is kind of linked to number 3 in terms of increased incentives. It might improve government finances. There's a possibility to improve government finances. So if workers are paying more wages, and particularly if they're more motivated and more productive, then businesses are going to make higher profits, or at least their profits aren't going to fall. Workers are going to earn more wages, they're going to pay more tax, they're perhaps going to spend more, and therefore pay more tax that way. So they may pay more VAT, they may pay more income tax if they're earning more income. And if there's greater incentive to work, and it means that workers are not living off benefits, then that could also improve the government's finances as well. Now, let's take some evaluation points on this. So looking perhaps not so much at the arguments against the minimum wage, but evaluation points here. So we've already seen that the minimum wage could create unemployment in the case of a perfectly competitive labour market. Neoclassical economic theory argues that it would create unemployment of E2 minus E1 in the previous diagram. Now, one argument is to say that if low-paid workers are paid a higher wage rate, then because workers tend to care more about their position relative to other workers, not their absolute income, then it could lead to other workers demanding a pay rise. So because you tend to measure your happiness and your worth and that kind of thing relative to other people, not in absolute terms, then if your neighbor is on the minimum wage and they get a pay rise, well, you're going to want a pay rise to keep up with the Joneses, to keep that distance. And that's called pay leapfrogging. Okay, pay leapfrogging. And of course, if you're paid just above the minimum wage and then you want to get paid more, then people just above you are going to want to get paid more as well. And you get this cascading, this leapfrogging effect all the way across the income distribution. So everyone starts to want a higher wage rate. And that could potentially lead you to get a wage price spiral effect and an inflationary effect in that instance. Although we argued earlier that today, many of those who are in poverty are in work, that's not to say that that's completely the case. Many of those in poverty are still not in work. So although the minimum wage is supposed to narrow in-work poverty and therefore narrow inequality, it is still the case that many of those individuals that are in poverty are not in work. So you're only going to solve the problem of relative poverty up to a point. With intervention in the labour market, people that don't work are not going to benefit. As ever, key evaluation point, the impact depends on the elasticity of demand and supply of labour and the size of the national minimum wage, or the size of the change in the national minimum wage. Now, again, we'll see shortly that there has been a big change in the national minimum wage in the UK in recent years. So that, again, is a way that you can distinguish your answer from other people's answers. And we'll also see that the UK minimum wage is now pretty high by international standards. It depends on the elasticity of demand and supply as well. So we could argue that in sectors which have a pretty low elasticity of demand, where robots are not necessarily going to replace the workers anytime soon, hairdressing might be quite a good example here, then just because we pay hairdressers a higher minimum wage doesn't necessarily mean that hair salons are suddenly going to start replacing hairdressers with robots. So demand may be fairly inelastic, and so the employment effects may be quite minimal. With any government policy, you can always bring in government failure. How do we know that the government is setting the correct minimum wage? It's quite a delicate balancing act that the government is facing when it sets a minimum wage. If it's too low, then the government will be accused of the minimum wage rate not solving the problems of poverty. Still, employers will be accused of exploiting workers if the minimum wage is too low. If it's too high, we will get unemployment and labour market failure. So getting the correct minimum wage is a problem. You can imagine if we set a minimum wage of £100 an hour, we would definitely get unemployment. There's no question about that. Now, clearly that's an absurd example, but it illustrates the point that you can't just keep raising and raising the minimum wage above inflation forever. At some point, there will be a situation where the minimum wage starts to cause more harm than good. In the UK, we probably haven't got there yet, but if the minimum wage continues to rise very, very quickly, and particularly in the current climate, and we're talking now in June 2020, at the height of the coronavirus epidemic, then we could start to see unemployment. And we'll see shortly as well that in the monopsony case, the impact on the labour market is quite different to in the competitive market. So it's different in the case of monopsony. So this graph shows us the change in the minimum wage since it was launched in the UK. You may not be aware that there was no national minimum wage in the UK until 1999. And this graph shows us the changes in the national minimum wage in real terms, so at 2020 prices. So this already strips out the effect of inflation. So any rise in the graph here, any rise in the line shows a real increase in the national minimum wage. And as we can see, despite a moderate downturn during the credit crunch years of 2007 to 2009, and then the austerity years 2009 to 2013, where the minimum wage did fall in real terms, we've got an on-trend increase, a sustained on-trend increase in real terms in the national minimum wage in the UK. So in real terms, the minimum wage has gone up and gone up quite significantly there. This graph was in 2019 before the election and was hypothesizing what Labour and the Conservatives would do if either of them got elected. The Conservatives plan to raise the minimum wage up to, I think it's $9.50 or $9.60 an hour by 2024, which is to bring the minimum wage in line with the expected average earnings. They want it to be 66%, I think, of average earnings, which is the main definition of relative poverty. So the plan is for a sustained increase in the national minimum wage. Whether that will happen, of course, in the current climate is unknown. And here we have an international comparison of minimum wages. Again, this is in real terms. So this is in dollars at purchasing power parity exchange rates. You should understand what that means from macro. So this is a Big Mac exchange rates. We have taken into account differences in the cost of living. So any differences here should not be due to differences in the cost of living. And we're comparing like with like. So we see that in the UK, our national minimum wage is actually pretty high compared to our major competitors. There are not many countries with a more generous minimum wage, and certainly not many countries with a substantially more generous minimum wage. Really only Luxembourg, Australia, the Netherlands, possibly Belgium. But really everybody else is either pretty much in line with our minimum wage or indeed is quite a bit lower. Notice that the UK national living wage is about a third higher than in the United States. So about a 30% difference there between the UK national minimum wage and the US national minimum wage. So the minimum wage is actually fairly generous by international standards. Again, that's a way that you could distinguish your answer from everybody else's answer if you were doing this in the exam. So finally, and this really is extension material, so you may want to skip this last 2 minutes if you want to, but again, it's a way that you can distinguish your answer. If you now think 20 minutes of the national minimum wage is plenty, you can stop the video at this point. But if you want to do a little bit of extension material, just hang on for 2 minutes and it will be worth it. So we've seen in the monopsony case that the employer employs the number of workers where the marginal cost of labour is equal to the marginal revenue product of labour, which in this case is Q1 workers. And we saw in the previous video that the wage rate paid is W1, which is lower than the competitive wage rate where supply meets demand. Now, what impact would a national minimum wage rate have in a monopsony? And the answer really is it depends on whereabouts the minimum wage rate would lie on this monopsony model. So let's say we impose a minimum wage rate that happens to be where the labour market clears. It could be anywhere between Q1 and Q star there. But let's say we impose, just to keep the analysis simple, let's say the national minimum wage rate is at NMW there. Well, in this case, the wage rate paid to workers in the monopsony actually rises from W1 to NMW. And the quantity of workers employed also rises from Q1 to Q star. So the new labour market equilibrium with a minimum wage, with a national minimum wage in a monopsony, is NMW Q star. So the higher wage rate expands us along the quantity supplied of labour, and the demand for labour at NMW is also Q star. That's where NMW there meets the demand curve. So as long as the minimum wage is below, as long as the minimum wage is below or at the point where supply meets demand, then there will be a big expansion in the quantity supplied of labour. As soon as you raise the minimum wage above NMW, you will start to get a contraction back along the demand curve and employment will start to fall again. But what we're saying then is a modest minimum wage will actually cause positive effects on the labour market. So again, this is a good evaluation point. Don't assume that that economists are saying the minimum wage always causes unemployment. Economists are not saying that. They're only saying that in the case of a perfectly competitive labour market. If it's a monopsony, minimum wages actually raise wages and raise employment in the labour market. So just to summarise that here, a minimum wage of NMW would boost employment by Q1 to Q star and wages by W1 to NM.